Welcome to this presentation. Today we're going to be talking about how to identify passive voice. So let's get started. There are three methods to identify passive voice, and we're going to cover all three methods. As we work through the three methods, you may find that one just kind of makes more intuitive sense to you. If that's the one that makes sense to you, then that's the one that you probably ought to use most of the time. I will tell you that any of these will work all of the time. Having said that, there are times, even if your go-to method is A, where you're likely to want to use go-to method B or go-to method C, or at least maybe confirm your analysis that you've done with your usual method by using one of the other two methods. That's one of the reasons why I present all three methods. Another reason I present all three methods is because there are some people that, boy, method 1 makes perfect sense, or method 2 makes perfect sense, or maybe method 3 doesn't make any sense at all. Everyone is a little bit different in this area, and so I like to present all three. If we get to a method that you think to yourself, oh my gosh, this makes no sense to me at all, or I can't figure this one out, no worries, you have two other methods to use. Having said that, the more tools you have in your arsenal, the more flexibility you're going to have about how you accomplish this. So please keep an open mind as we go through the three methods. And let me first of all explain what the three methods relate to. The first method focuses upon the verb. The second method focuses upon the subject. I'm going to add noun here. I'll just say subject noun. And then the last method focuses on the by prepositional phrase, and we'll put that in blue. Again, you can use all three, and if you're not certain, it makes sense to use all three. As you're doing assignments in this area, or just generally in life, it's good to have a little cheat sheet. This may be fresh in your memory now, but in 2 or 3 weeks, you might have forgotten some of the finer points of this. No worries, just have your cheat sheet handy. Once you do this for a little while, though, it will become second nature to know what's passive voice and what's not passive voice. This is a skill you will use literally every day of your career as a paralegal. I use it every day of my life as an attorney. There isn't a day that goes by that I'm not evaluating my sentences to see, is that passive voice, is it an active voice? At some point, though, it becomes so intuitive that you don't even think, am I evaluating from that perspective? You just do it, and then you make the corrections that you need to. But this is really not an academic skill. It's hard for me to think of any skill that you are going to use more commonly in your practice than this one. Are there paralegals and even attorneys who routinely use the passive voice when they shouldn't? Yes, there are. They are not going to be the successful, awesome, amazing legal professionals that you're going to be, though. This is one of the ways that you can distinguish yourself from the run-of-the-mill legal professional. You can be that person who is a really superb writer. And this is one of the most important basic skills that is going to get you to that level. It's relatively easy to do, but it's like anything else in life. Until you've practiced it for a while, it's going to seem a little clunky. I compare it to riding a bicycle. When I was 6, my dad took me into the neighborhood and put me on the bicycle. And what he would do is he'd run alongside of me and then let go. Well, guess what happened the first few times? I fell. It hurt. I didn't like it. But you know what? It didn't take too many of those experiences before it clicked. And now, even though I haven't ridden a bicycle in, gosh, probably years, certainly months, if I were to get on a bicycle, I might be wobbly for a few turns of the wheel, but my muscle memory would kick right in and I'd be just fine riding a bicycle. This is similar. It's going to feel clunky. It's going to feel a little awkward. But if you keep going, if you keep on practicing, if you really focus on this for a period of time, it will become second nature to you. I promise you. Okay. But of course, if you only spend 30 minutes listening to this presentation and you spend 30 minutes doing an assignment, you're not going to get to that point. It will remain an elusive goal for you. I don't want that for you. You don't want that for you. So invest the time to get this nailed down. Let me give you another little bit of encouragement. This is a big part of legal writing, that course that we're offering. So it's not something you need to know simply because you're going to use it in your career. although that's a pretty darn good reason, but you also need it for another course that we have in the program. And so if you learn it now, you're just saving yourself pain later on. So it's either now or later. You might as well learn it now, reap the benefits grade-wise now of the mastery, instead of kind of accepting a bad grade on some assignments in this course and then having to learn anyway later on. So let's get started. We're going to talk about the verb form method first. And I have another tool that I'm going to flip to so we can look at that. Here we go. So the verb form method. We have the to be verb. And the to be verb has 8 forms. We have am, are, is. These are the present tense for the to be verb. Then we have was, were. This is the past tense. And then we have the infinitive and the past participles, well, all the participles, present participle and past participle. You don't need to know any of those names, but you do need to commit these 8 terms to memory. But if you think about it, they're all about to be. I am, you are, he is, I was, they were, be, being, and been. And again, you don't really have to commit them to memory, though. What you can do is just write them down on a piece of paper and file it away. So as we're working on that first option, the verb form, whenever you are looking for passive voice, you have to find one of these words or you know for sure it's not passive voice. It can have every other trapping of passive voice that you can imagine, but if it is lacking one of these 8 words, it is grammatically impossible for it to be passive voice. Now it could, if I'm going to put one little caveat, it could be that the person has used a contraction. He's murdered in Act 4. Well, obviously this is short for he is murdered in Act 4. So you have to consider contractions. But if you're willing to remember that an apostrophe S is also potentially one of these, apostrophe S, I'm sorry. They're not going to let me do the apostrophe the right way. Apostrophe S can be short for is. It also can be short for has, so you don't know for sure. I also list, so you have to have one of these 8 words here. I also list some helping verbs. You don't need to know these for this class. There are 23 of them, but it's not necessary for this class you know them. I'm listing them to show you how the to be verbs fit into this universe. These are not to be verbs. These are to be verbs. A fair number of students will get these confused and will start thinking these count as one of the verbs that's going to allow me to have passive voice. No. You can have one of these verbs in your verbal phrase and still it be passive voice if you also have one of these. You have to have one of these. You can have one of these or you may not have one of these. They're irrelevant to your diagnosis of the sentence being passive voice or active voice. So I'm not flagging these so you commit these to memory, but just letting you see these are not, let me just cross it out here. These have nothing to do with figuring out whether it's passive voice. These are the ones you care about. Okay, so that's the first thing you need. You need a to be verb. You need one of these 8 verbs. But that's not all you need. If that's all you needed, identifying passive voice would be super, super, super easy, even easier than it really is. And nobody would have problems with it. But unfortunately, of course, life's a little bit more complicated than that. There's another step that you need. In addition to having a to be verb, you also need a past participle. Okay, well, let's talk for a second about what a past participle is. There are 2 participles in English. We have present participles and past participles. A present participle typically ends ing. It's also called sometimes a gerund, present participle. So I am singing. That's a present participle. The singing is a present participle. I'll put it in blue. So whenever you see a word, I am talking, that would be another one. That is another example of a present participle. You may look at this and go, wait a second, we have the verb am. Let's just take this. We'll make this you are talking. So we have some variety here. You are talking. You can say, well, we have am, which is a to be verb, and we have are, which is a to be verb. We must have passive voice here. Well, no, we don't, because these are present participles. But what we need to make passive voice is we need a past participle. A very common point of confusion for folks diagnosing sentences as passive or active voices, they think a present participle also causes a sentence to be in passive voice. No, only the past participle causes to be passive voice. Okay, so we know the ing ending doesn't make it passive. We know these words don't make it passive. We know that we need to have a to be verb and we need to have a past participle. But let's diagnose what a past participle is. There are three formats for past participle in English. One is ed, that's that suffix. One is en, and the other, unfortunately, is irregular. Okay. You can see, so let me give you some examples. I was talked to. Not very nice, very well said, but it works. That's an example. Let's look at the parts that we have. Okay, we have our to be verb, and we have our past participle. So we have the two requirements that we need for the first way of identifying passive voice. This is a passive voice sentence. I was talked to. We know it's passive voice because it has the two elements we need. For it to be passive, we need to be verb and past participle. You can have other stuff in the verb phrase, but you have to have these two parts. For example, I will have been talked to. That is also passive voice. We have been, which is our to be verb. We have talked, which is our past participle. We also have two other words in our phrase. We don't need to have them to have passive voice, but we can have extra words. But we need to have a to be verb and a past participle. So this is one example, the past participle with an ed ending. Now you may be thinking to yourself, especially if grammar is not your thing, well, gee whiz, I thought the ed ending in English was past tense. Well, you're right. The ed ending can reflect a verb that is in past tense, or it can reflect a passive voice structure, a past participle structure. It can also do other things too, but I don't want to confuse this with more information than we need. For example, I could use a sentence, I talked. I talked, well, I talked, that sentence is lacking a to be verb, so we know it's not passive voice. This is active voice. Because it's active voice, we know that this is not a past part. By the way, past participle can be used for purposes other than passive voice. But we know that this is our verb in the sentence because it's our verb with no to be verb. We know that we're using it in the past tense. Well, we'll work with that assumption for now. So you will have ed words. And when I say ed verbs, I mean verbs that end with the ed suffix that are not acting as past participles, that are just acting as past tense. But you know this sentence isn't going to be a passive voice because we're lacking the to be verb. Okay, let's look at the en ending. I was eaten by the cannibal. Okay, here we have a to be verb, was. See, it's on our list right here. And we have eaten. Almost always when you see a verb or word ending en, it's going to be a past participle. So that's a really handy way of identifying them. I was eaten. That's clearly a passive voice. Now, sometimes people think to yourself, well, what's the difference between passive voice and past tense? It can be confusing because in this case, we have, this is past tense, passive voice. Voice and tense are different things. But we know it's past tense because look, I'm using the to be verb in the past tense right up here. We know was means something that happened in the past. Am, are, and is are currently happening. Let me switch this. Let me write the same sentence in the present tense. I am being eaten by the cannibal. This is present. It's actually present progressive sense, but it's a type of present tense, passive voice. We can also say, I am eaten by the cannibal. Again, present tense, passive voice. And you can say, even though this is present tense, we're still using the version of the verb that is a past participle. So this is the past participle part is always going to kind of sound a little bit to you like it's past tense. Let's look at future tense. I will have been eaten by the cannibal. This isn't pure future tense, but it's a type of future tense. Here's a simple future tense. I will be eaten by the cannibal. Future tense. And you can see, even though this clearly means that I am anticipating I'm going to be dinner for somebody tomorrow, maybe. I'll maybe just add the word tomorrow. Tomorrow I will be eaten by the cannibal. I'm still using this eaten word, which ordinarily kind of suggests something that happened in the past. So these are some examples of how you can see it. In each one of these cases, I have a to be verb, to be verb, to be verb, to be verb, and I have, actually in this case, we have two to be verbs. You can have more than one. And then we have our past participle. Oops, I guess I did not successfully do that. Past participle. Past participle. Okay, now let's consider this category of irregular verbs. This is what makes it difficult, I'll be honest with you. Option number one, in some sense, the verb format is oftentimes the easiest way. It's easy peasy if you have a verb that ends en. It's even pretty easy if you have a verb that ends ed. But when you have an irregular one, it can be tricky. And that's one of the reasons why I encourage you, even if this format makes perfect sense to you, to also have a backup tool, because you might have an irregular verb. So let me give you an example. I was hit by the ball. We don't say in English, I was hitted by the ball. We don't say, I was hitten by the ball. Our past participle for hit is just hit. It's also our past tense for hit. So you will find a few, there are not a ton of them, but a few that are irregular, that don't become a past participle with the addition of the ed or en. Unfortunately, they are some of the most common verbs. That's pretty common in English and in other languages, that our most common verbs are also likely to be our most irregular verbs. So when you apply this verb form method, and you at the end say, gee whiz, I'm not sure if I have a past participle or not, no worries. There's a couple things you can do. One thing you can do is you can go to a dictionary, because usually, or many dictionaries will list the past participle, especially if it's an irregular past participle. Let me just Google and see if I can find that. Here we go. Past participle of hit. And you can see I Googled it, and you can see it says past simple hit, past participle hit, present participle or gerund hitting. Let me just do a definition of hit, see what we get here. Definition hit, let's see if they list This one doesn't. Let's look at this definition, see if it lists the past participles. It lists hit and hitting. But they don't tell you what this is for. So let me do another. Let me do eat. See what they say here with Miriam. Eaten, ate, eaten, and eating. So again, it might be a little bit tricky to find out which one is. Let's just look for English learners. Maybe they get a little bit more grammatical here. Again, they have it listed here, but they don't tell you what part of speech it is. So probably what I would do if I have the luxury is I'd probably just type in past participle of eat. Past participle of eat. If I can't remember what it is, eat verb conjugation. And we have past participle here, eaten. So again, that's that can be a way of approaching finding out what the answer is. So again, if you're not sure of the past participle, or if you have a past participle, one way would be just to Google it. Another way would be to use method 2 or method 3. And you can at least double check if one of your methods fails you, always turn to another method. Okay, so now we're going to go back to our methodology. Hopefully that makes sense. We have taken care of our first method. So we're going to go to our, actually let me make sure there was anything I wanted to talk to you about with respect to that before we go on. Okay, so now, here by the way, we won't talk about that. Okay, so let's go on and talk about our second method, which is the subject-verb method. This one is probably the most, I'm going to call it logic-based. I mean, they're all logical, but the most logical or the most meaning-oriented version of the sentence. So if grammar really, really doesn't work for you, this is probably the one that's going to make the most sense because it's not focused upon grammar rules, it's focused upon the underlying meaning of the sentence. Okay, so let's look at method number 2. Here is the way that we write sentences in active voice. We start out with the subject, then we have a verb, and then we usually have a direct object. So let me just write this up here. Bob sings a song. Okay, well, we're starting the sentence with a subject. In this case, it's Bob. I'm going to put that in yellow. That's our subject. He's going to do our verb. Well, let's find our verb. We have our verbal phrase here. In this case, the verbal phrase is super short. It's just one word, sings. Is Bob doing the singing in this sentence? Well, yes, he sure is. We know that. If we are English speakers, English readers, we know that when we say Bob sings a song, what we're saying is that Bob is doing the action of singing. And then we have a direct object, and this is what is receiving the song, the singing, I guess you could say. That's a little bit of a clunky, artificial way of looking at it, but that's what we mean when we say direct object. It is Bob's singing is directed at the song. Those are the song are the notes that are coming out of his mouth. And so this is how we do active voice sentences. It's how most of us talk most of the time. But that's not how passive voice sentences are. We still have a subject, a verbal phrase, and we have typically a direct object. let's see. So we're going to change this around. A song is sung by Bob. So we start out with our subject in our passive voice sentence. And now again, it's going to be song. And then we have our verbal phrase in our passive voice sentence. It's now this phrase is sung. And then we have our object. We're going to call it object of the preposition. We're not going to call it direct object, but it's the same idea for the most part. And that is Bob. Okay, so, oops, didn't mean to do that. Okay. Okay, so we have here subject, but in a passive voice sense, the subject doesn't do the verb. It receives the action of the verb. And the object of the preposition is the entity that does the verb. Well, let's look at this. Is the song singing? Well, a song is an inanimate object. It doesn't have lungs. It doesn't have a voice. It can't make a sound in and of its own. So that doesn't make any sense. But the action of singing is being done to the song. And that's a weird way of saying it, but that's the concept. This is the song that Bob is singing. Who's doing the action? Who is singing the song? Well, that's Bob. If the object of the preposition is doing the verb, is Bob doing the singing? Well, yes, he sure is. Okay, now we have our passive voice sentence structure. So you can see these two sentences mean exactly the same thing. Bob sings a song is sung by Bob. But you can see how the ordering of things are different. Bob begins one sentence, he ends another sentence. Song ends one sentence, it begins the second sentence. Let's look at our first rule elements, the verb form. Does this sentence have a to be verb? Well, no, it doesn't have any of the 8 words, that we're looking for. It doesn't have am, are, is, was, were, be, being, or been. It doesn't have an apostrophe s to reflect a contraction. So we know, without any more review, we know this can't be passive voice. Let's look at our next one. This is our verbal phrase. Well, look, we do have a to be verb. We have the verb is. Let's look at the list just to confirm. Yeah, here we go. Here's the verb is, part of the to be verb. And now we have sung. Well, gee whiz, sung doesn't end ed or en. Well, let's Google that. What part of speech is sung? I don't know if this is going to tell us or not exactly. Here, let's see. Okay, it's a simple past tense and past participle of sing. So sing is an irregular verb. It's a past participle. So now that we know that information, we know that we have a to be verb and a past participle. So we know under our first method, our verb form method, that we've hit pay dirt. If we have that verb form method, if we have the to be verb and the past participle, we know it's passive voice. We don't even need to be able to understand the sentence. I could write this. And that has to be passive voice. It doesn't matter that I don't understand it. It doesn't matter that these are words that are not in my vocabulary. By definition, if I have is sung in this sentence, it has to be passive. But in this case, we don't need to rely upon that grammar technical rule. We can look at the meaning, and we can say if my first noun or pronoun, or the noun or pronoun that comes to the left or before my verb, if that is what is receiving the verb, then that means it's in passive voice. So this is our second rule. This requires, though, that you understand what the sentence means. And sometimes that may not be possible, especially if it's a very long, very complex sentence with lots of legal terms. So this method works a lot of times, but it doesn't work every time. Let's just do a little review of our method one, which is the verbal structure. As I say, I call this the easiest method, but it does require that you know the to be verb, and it also requires that you be able to find the past participle. First thing you have to do is you have to identify that entire verbal phrase. Once you've found it, you have to look for one of those to be verbs. If you can't find it, you know you have active voice. Then you have to look for that past participle. If you can't find it, you know it's active voice. If you're not sure though, Google it or try a different method to confirm that. Keep in mind that you can have other helping verbs, and so the fact that it has the word has or will or shall or something like that doesn't mean it can't be passive voice, but doesn't mean for sure that it is. Now we have our second method. I call this the second easiest method, but again, what's easy to one person may be more difficult to another person. So the first thing here is you're going to identify that subject of the sentence. Typically, it's going to be the first noun or pronoun in the sentence, but there can be really long sentences where that's not the case. Let me just show you here in this sentence. I'm going to put this sentence in gray here so we can look at it. You can see that the first pronoun in this sentence is the word there. I'll put that in blue. The second noun, or first noun in the sentence is clause. But this whole structure here is an introductory clause. I'll put this in blue. It's an introductory clause. You can see it's set off with a comma, but not all introductory clauses are set off from a comma. So usually the best rule of thumb isn't to look for the first noun or pronoun, but instead it's useful to find the verb. Here's our verb right here. And to go to the left. And usually it'll be your first noun or pronoun to the left of the verb. You can't 100% be certain about that. That's a usual pattern, but it doesn't work every single time. So again, you're going to look and you're going to figure out what it might be. Let's say, I'll give you an example of how it might not work. The subject of the sentence. Well, if we found the verb, we've gone to the left. Well, the first left that we'll find is the word sentence. But actually, this is a prepositional phrase. So what the subject is this word right here, subject. So you can see if you look for the first verb or noun or pronoun in the sentence, you're not going to find subject. If you look to your verb and go to the left, you're not going to find subject. So you have to consider the inherent meaning of the sentence. As a result, method number 2 is usually not the best method to use if you have a long sentence. If you have difficulty identifying the subject of a sentence, then that means don't use this method, or at least don't use the method when the sentence is complex. Okay, I'm going to get rid of all this formatting here. So we have to identify the subject of the sentence. If you can't do that for a particular sentence, move on to a different method. Then we're going to identify the entire verb. Keep in mind that a verb can be a single sentence, a single word, or it can be 5 or 6 words long. And so you have to be able to identify the entire verb. Now I say in method 1 that you ought to identify the entire verb, but really you don't have to. All you have to do is find the past participle and the to be verb. There may be other parts of the verb. If you don't find them, that's okay because you're just looking for certain parts of it. So again, if you have trouble finding things like the subject or finding things like the verb, method 2 may not be the go-to method for you. So once you've found the subject and the verb, and you know now what the verb is about, then you look at the sentence and think logically, in this sentence, does the writer mean that the subject is doing the verb? If it does mean that, you have active voice. If it doesn't mean that, then you probably have passive voice. But let me pause and give you an example of a sentence that I think is helpful to think about. The flower is pink. So we've identified our verb. We're going to put that in pink. I guess that's appropriate. Then we're going to go to the left of our verb. And gosh, we only have one noun or pronoun, so we know this is it. And so now we have the flower is pink. Is the flower doing the verb is? Well, the flower isn't doing anything, right? I mean, the flower just sits there. Actually, let's just change it and let's make it a rock. That really is an inanimate object. Well, a rock can't do anything. So you might be tempted to say, well, gee whiz, a rock can't do anything, so it can't be doing the verb. The verb is, so it must be passive voice. Well, actually, it's not. This is a to-be verb. This is what we call a linking verb. A to-be verb doesn't suggest action. It suggests a state of being. And so inherently, it's kind of a boring sentence. Nothing really happens in a to-be sentence, to-be verb sentence when you don't have some other verb in it. And so this is active voice even though nothing really happens. So the important thing to remember is active voice doesn't mean there's some movement or there's some event that happens where something is changed after the end of the sentence. A to-be verb can absolutely be an active voice sentence. So this is active voice. There will be other sentences that you can imagine that don't create mental images in your head. Another one is, the boy has a rock. Again, he's not doing anything with the rock, he's just possessing it. Let me just flag it here. We have our verb, has, and we go to the left of the verb, we have boy. Again, you may be thinking, well, the boy's not doing anything, so it must be passive voice. Well, no. To have something doesn't mean you're taking some action. So he is actually doing the verb have, even though there's no visual movement that's happening. This is active voice. So sometimes when people do method 2, they misapply the rule, especially when you have a verb like is or has or does is another one that sometimes can throw folks. There's some others too. So be on the lookout for that. If you see one of these simple verbs, and especially in a sentence where nothing seems to be going on, you may want to also test it against method 1, because if you were to test it against method 1, you'd be able to see, well, in this first sentence, the rock is pink. Well, I have a to-be verb, is a to-be verb, but gosh, I don't have any past participle, so it's got to be active voice. And I look at the sentence, the boy has a rock. I don't have any of their to-be verbs. I don't have am, are, is. I don't have was, were. I don't have be, being, and been. I have has, and so therefore I know it has to be active voice. So method 2 can be tricky. There will be times that you do it that you might get confused and think it's passive voice when it really isn't. Let me get rid of this here. So going back to our sentence, come up with another one. The boy throws the rock. So we have our subject. Well, let's find our verb first. Our verb is throws. We go to the left of the verb throws. We have boy as our subject. Is boy doing the verb? Is he throwing something? Well, he sure is in this sentence. And so we know under this first test that yes, it is active voice. But we can continue on with the test. And now we're going to identify the direct object. It's going to usually be soon after the verb. So we have our verb. We're going to go to the right of the verb. We have the word rock. And is it receiving the action? Is it being thrown? Well, yes, it is being thrown. So in this case, using method 2, we've been able to prove that this sentence is active voice using both of these tools. I will be honest with you, though, you won't always have a direct object. This is a perfectly grammatically correct sentence. The boy throws. We don't know what he's throwing. But whatever he's throwing, it's still a grammatically correct sentence. You usually do not need a direct object in English. And so its absence doesn't make this sentence passive. It doesn't make the sentence ungrammatical. It is a grammatically correct sentence. It is an active voice. So don't worry about you not having this. If you don't have this, it's okay. But if you aren't sure based upon your first part of the test whether it's active or passive, go on and do this part to see if it works out. So if either the first part of this test or the second part tells you it's active voice, then you know it's active voice. Okay, now we're going to talk about the third part. This is the most fun part. I'm saving it for last. For many folks, this is the easiest. It's kind of silly. Let me go back to my list here. So we've done the verb form method. We've done the subject noun method. And now we're ready for by a blue monkey method. That's my terminology for it. You can call it something else. Some people like to say by a zombie, or by a green zombie, or whatever you want to do. Whatever your expression is, just kind of make it fun. And what you're going to do in your sentence is you're going to look for the word by. Okay, it would be great if English used by for only one purpose. We don't live in that universe. By can be used for lots of different purposes. Let me actually just Google the definition of by. Here we have definition of by. Here we go with Merriam-Webster. Okay, so you can see the first definition we have is not the one we're interested in. Near to is what we're going through here. We actually have to get down through definition 4 to get to the definition we're looking for, which is the passive voice definition. So you have to make sure, if you use this method, that the word that you have in your sentence, the by that you have in your sentence, you're using the correct way. Let me give you an example. I was shot by the river. Or let me change this. Larry was shot by the river. He died 3 days later. Okay. Well, when we read this sentence, we know the river doesn't have a gun. And he's not. The river isn't aiming a gun at Larry and shooting him with a gun. We know that. What we have in our minds when we hear this first sentence is we have a visual image. Larry is in close proximity to the river. Maybe he's standing, maybe he's sitting, maybe he's laying down. Someone comes up with a gun and shoots him. And that's what happened in this particular scenario. So we know that we mean in this sentence near to. But let me change the word river out and say Larry was shot by the murderer. Well, now we know that the murderer here has a gun, and he's aimed the gun at Larry, and he shot Larry. He might actually be very far away from Larry. He might be a sharpshooter who's, 200 feet away. He might be a sniper or something. We don't know how close he is to Larry. The by here isn't talking about physical proximity. It's talking about agency. Who's doing the action? I'll repeat Larry so it's clear who's doing it. So you can see there are two meanings for the word by. Now we can combine them. Larry was shot by the river by the murderer. And you're not thinking that Larry was standing next to a murderer and the river got up and shot him. You know that here we mean near to, and here we mean by the agency of. So when you're reading sentences, don't automatically assume without thinking which version of by do we have. Okay. Sometimes in passive voice sentences, you will actually have a by in the sentence. Let's go back and look at some of our earlier sentences that we looked at. I was eaten by the cannibal. I wasn't standing near the cannibal. I mean, I guess maybe I was if he was eating me, but we're not talking about physical proximity. We're talking about the fact that the cannibal is the one who is doing the action. And so we are using by in the sense of passive voice. Let me just change it. I was eaten by the river, by the cannibal. River's not eating me, cannibal's eating me. I am being eaten by the cannibal. I am eaten by the cannibal. I will have been eaten by the cannibal. Tomorrow I will be eaten by the cannibal. I was hit by the ball. It's possible that I was hit by a bullet as I stood next to the ball. So it's possible that what I meant by this sentence is not the ball actually hit me, but that I happened to be in close proximity to the ball. Most of us, though, would understand the ordinary meaning of that sentence, which admittedly is a little ambiguous, to mean that the ball is actually the one hitting me. Let me just change this up. I was hit by Larry. Again, it's possible what we mean is I was standing next to Larry and George came up and hit me. But most of the time what this means is Larry came up and hit me. He may have been near to me, he probably was if he's hitting me, but I'm not emphasizing the physical proximity, I'm talking about agency here. Okay. Obviously these are bad sentences, I should put those so nobody gets confused about that. Okay, so now we have a song is sung by Bob. Okay, it is possible that the song is being sung in close proximity to Bob, but Bob isn't singing at all. Maybe Larry is singing the song and Bob is standing there quietly. And what I mean to say is that Larry is singing the song in close proximity to Bob. But most of the time, we're going to interpret this sentence to mean Bob is the one singing, he is doing that action. So when you see a by verb and it doesn't mean in close proximity to, then you're going to look at that word and say, is the noun or pronoun that comes after that, is it doing the verb? Is Bob doing is sung? Well, yes, he is. Is the cannibal eating me? Why, yes, he is. Is Larry hitting me? He sure is. In those cases, this is our third way of identifying the passive voice. If instead it was, I was hit by the river, then we need to stop and think, is the river hitting me? Gosh, that doesn't make any sense. So I think that we're using the other meaning of by in that case, and so the sentence may not be in passive voice. So many passive voice sentences actually have the by phrase in it. Sometimes, though, the sentence is lacking the by phrase. It might lack the by phrase for a couple of reasons. One reason is that it may be obvious in the context who did the action. Or that's one reason. Another reason is that the writer might be intending to kind of hide or minimize the actor. Doesn't want to focus upon the actor, but wants to focus upon the action. That's a second reason people use or drop the by phrase. A third reason can be that we don't know who did the action. So let me write a sentence. My child was bitten. My 3-year-old child comes running into the house sobbing uncontrollably. He's got blood dripping from his leg. He's been in the backyard. He is so hysterical that he can't even speak clearly. I have no idea what's bitten him. I call 911, my child was bitten. I don't say my child was bitten by blah, 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 because I don't know who bit my child. When I don't know the action, I'm not likely to add a by phrase. Let's say that I know it's by Ralph the Chihuahua. Well, it may not be that important to the dispatcher that it was Ralph instead of Maurice the Chihuahua. Now, admittedly, the dispatcher may want to know that my child was bitten by a dog instead of a rattlesnake, um, or was bitten by a dog that is a family pet that has had its rabies shots versus a wild dog or another animal. So that may be relevant to the situation. But maybe what I'm most concerned with right now is my son is bleeding a great deal. I am focused upon the injury and less concerned with how it happened, why it happened, who did it. I'm focused upon my bleeding child. That can be another time. Another time that we use passive voice without the by expression is we want to minimize the culpability or the importance of the actor. Imagine that you are a criminal defense attorney or paralegal. In that situation, many times you are a regular user of passive voice without the by expression. Let's assume for a second that you know your client is really, really guilty. There's lots of witnesses who will put your client at the scene of the crime. It's just really, really obvious. Let's say your client is Bob. There's 10 people who all saw Bob kill Larry. 5 of them are members of the cloth. There's just no way you're going to be able to argue that Bob didn't do it. As part of your defense, maybe your defense is insanity or some other methodology. But anyway, your defense really isn't that Bob is factually innocent. So you're going to find yourself periodically saying, Larry was killed. Or maybe Larry was shot. You could go around saying, my client Bob shot Larry. And it's kind of an unavoidable fact, but you don't really see the need to constantly remind the jury of the fact that it was your client who did it. So you're much more likely to use these expressions. You can't dispute the fact that Larry was killed, that Larry was shot, but you don't have to shine a spotlight upon your client's culpability. So this can be a way of kind of diminishing that. Using passive voice allows you to drop the subject, grammatically speaking. Another reason that sometimes people use passive voice is that we'll talk about that later. Let me go on and talk more about this one. So we have I said my child was bitten. When I have a sentence, let's just go through methods 1 and 2 to see that it is in fact passive voice. Okay, so we have a to be verb. The verb was. And we have a past participle, bitten. When you have an en ending, it's almost certainly going to be a past participle. So we know under method 1 that we have a passive voice sentence. Let's consider the second one. Here's our verbal phrase. We go to the left, we find child, which is our subject. Is this child biting anything in this story? No, he's receiving the action of the bite. And so with our with our method number 2, we know that it's passive voice. Method 3, though, applying the by rule, we look through the whole sentence, we don't ever see the word by. So we can't use this part of method 3. But we can rewrite the sentence, my child was bitten by a blue monkey. Or, if you prefer, my child was bitten by a rabid zombie. Whatever you want, whatever seems fun to you. We have our verb by, which is the past participle that suggests agency. And then we look to the left of by until we come to a noun or pronoun, and that's the object of our prepositional phrase by. This is going to be the entity that is doing our verb if, in fact, our sentence is in passive voice. Same will apply here. We have the by, by, and now we have a rabid zombie. Okay. So when we look at this sentence, my child was bitten by a blue monkey. In your mind, do you think, having heard this sentence, that the monkey's teeth are locked down on the child? Well, yes, you do. That's what this sentence is telling you. My child was bitten by a rabid zombie. Again, you're imagining some green zombie-like person chomping down on the kid. That's the mental image. When you have those mental images, this tells you it's passive voice. So that is the 3 methods. You can use all 3. I encourage you to have all 3 in your toolbox so that when one doesn't seem to be working out too well for you, or you want to confirm, you can apply to the others. Let's pause for a second, though, before we make any further progress on this and talk about why do we care about passive voice? Why do we care about active voice? The first thing to say is that both passive voice and active voice are grammatically correct. One's not more grammatically correct than the other. They're both very grammatically correct structures. I mean, you can mess both up, but if they're done correctly, they're perfectly good structures. So we're not talking about violating a grammar rule by using passive voice. Another thing to put out on the table with passive voice is that there will be times in your career that you will use passive voice, and it will be a wise decision. Passive voice is not always evil or bad. Most of the time it is, and most of the time that you and I write it, it will be a poor stylistic decision on our parts. But there will be times where it's the right call. Let me give you some examples of times where it's the right call. There are certain idiomatic expressions in English that we do in the passive voice. I can't think of any right now, but there are some. Take my word for it. It doesn't make sense to switch it around necessarily. Then there are other times where you don't know who the actor is, and so you use passive voice, or you want to diminish the role of the actor, you want to use passive voice. So those are times where it's very legitimate to use passive voice. Another time to use passive voice, particularly in legal writing, this is rarely relevant in other writing styles, but there are times, not a lot, but there are times in legal writing where you intentionally want to be boring. You want the reader's eyes to glaze over. Not often do you want this. In fact, it's very rare, or at least rare. But there are certain times in legal writing, because you have to be truthful, you have to be candid with the court, that you have to share facts that you're thinking to yourself, gosh, I wish I didn't have to say this. Imagine you're representing Bob. There's the 10 witnesses who all swear Bob killed Larry. You're filing a brief with the court. You're going to have to be honest about what those witnesses saw. You can't lie to the court. And so you might have to come forward and say, you know what, this is what happened. But just because you have to be candid with the court doesn't mean you have to write your most brilliant prose in that section. You want that particular section of your brief to be boring, hard to understand, tedious, uninteresting. And so you might write your sentences especially long. You might write sentences that are very dense and complex and hard to understand. You might use passive voice. Now, in this class, that is never our goal. Our goal is never to intentionally write poorly. Also, we never want to use passive voice intentionally. I'm telling you there are times where it's okay to use it, but for this course, assume like that doesn't even apply, that there are no times. Work under the assumption that passive voice is a no-no under all circumstances, because in order to get used to writing an active voice, you have to kind of go cold turkey. It's almost like if you have been drinking coffee a lot of days in a row and your body's gotten used to it, you might need to just stop for a few days. So it might be a little bit uncomfortable to get that caffeine out of your system, and then you're fine. Similarly with passive voice, you're probably going to want to just stop using it for a while. Certainly in this course, stop using it so that you can get familiar with what it feels like to write an active voice. But it's not always wrong. A good rule of thumb with passive voice outside of this class is no more than 10% of the time. Is it wrong to use passive voice? Is it always wrong? Absolutely not. I'm going to open up another Word document. Actually, let me just open up a new one here. And I'm going to write a couple of sentences here. Okay, so this is our essay. I want to figure out whether these are passive or active voice sentences. We'll go through each one of these and see whether it is or is not. But before we do that, we're going to have Word give us some help. To do that, I go to Review. I go to Grammar and Spelling. Okay, I'm now going to go in because I don't have this set up yet. So I'm going to show you how to set this up with the version of Word that I have. Each version of Word, unfortunately, is a little bit different. And so you have to kind of experiment to figure out how it works. I'm going to go to File here. I'm going to go down to Options. I'm going to go to, I think it's Proofing. And I am going to go here to Grammar. Actually, this just has Grammar. Okay, it's not going to do this. Okay, this version of Word does not have grammar, and some do though, so I apologize. I didn't realize this one only has, but if you have a version of Word that allows us, you would go to Options, and then you would go to Proofing, and then where it says Grammar, you'd say Grammar and Style, and it would allow you to proof for passive voice. Okay, so we're going to go through these 4 sentences and identify whether they're passive or not. So I'm going to separate the sentences so we can look at each one individually. Okay, and I'm going to use method 1 on all of these. I found our verbal phrase here. We have the verb was, which is a to be verb. We have the verb bitten, which is a past participle. So I know this is a passive sentence. Let's go down to our next one. I'm looking at the whole sentence. Here's our verbal phrase. We don't have any to be verb. Injected could be a past participle, but because we don't have a to be verb, we know this sentence is active. Now the next sentence. Here's our verbal phrase. We have was, which is a to be verb. We have rushed. It ends ed. That tells us it's likely to be a past participle. So this tells us it's in passive voice. Our last sentence, we don't have any to be verb. The past participle of give is given, not gave. So we know that it doesn't have either part. So this has to be active voice. So that's our method 1. Now let's go back and do method 2, which is looking at the subject of the sentence. Here is our verb. We go to the left of the verb. We see the word boy. Well, here we go. Is boy doing any biting? Well, no, he's receiving the bite. That tells us it's passive. Let's go down to our next sentence. Here's our verb. We go to the left of the verb. We have the word snake. Is snake injecting something? Well, yeah. Snake is injecting something. He's injecting poison into the boy. So that tells us it's active. We also have a direct object here. Is it receiving the action of being injected? It sure is. So that's another indication it's active. Let's go to our next sentence. Here's our verb. We go to the left. We have the word boy. Is the boy rushing? Well, he's in the vehicle that is rushing, but he himself is not doing anything. Somebody else is rushing him there. So this one is a little bit confusing, I concede, because if you're looking at the meaning of the sentence, yes, he's in the car going fast, so in some sense he's rushing. So this is one of the reasons why, if you're not sure, go ahead and check another method. And then we have our last sentence. We have our verb here, gave. We go to the left. We have doctor. The doctor gave. Is the doctor giving something in this case? Well, sure. He's giving the medicine that's going to help the boy. So that is active voice. We also have, after the verb gave, we have a direct object, boy. Is the boy receiving something that is being given? Well, he sure is. So that's our second indication under method 2 that we have an active voice sentence. Now we're going to use our third method. The boy was bitten by the snake. We don't need to add by a blue monkey in this case because we have already a by expression. When we read this sentence, the boy was bitten by the snake, we know that the snake is the actor. He's the one chomping down. And so that tells us it's passive. It doesn't mean that the dog was bitten by the chihuahua and at the same time the boy was being bitten, he was in close proximity to the snake. That's not what we ordinarily think that sentence means. Let's look at the next sentence. The snake injected venom into the boy. We don't have the word by in this sentence. So we're going to have to add this, and I'm going to add by a blue monkey. I'm going to put in parentheses so I can remember, hey, this is my little addition. It's not the original sentence. So now we have by, and what we're trying to figure out now is whether this monkey here is actually doing the verb. The snake injected venom into the boy by the blue monkey. When you hear that sentence, do you think that the monkey is injecting something into the boy? No. Insofar as the sentence makes sense at all, the boy is close to the blue monkey at the time that he's being bitten by the snake. So again, because the blue monkey isn't doing anything in this sentence, it's active voice. Next sentence, the boy was rushed to the hospital. We don't have a by expression, so now we are going to have to add it by a blue monkey. So we have our by, and we have our monkey. When you read this sentence, does its meaning suggest that the monkey is rushing the boy? The boy was rushed to the hospital by a blue monkey. Well, I mean, it's silly. Obviously, a blue monkey isn't driving the ambulance, but that's literally what it means, that the blue monkey is rushing the boy to the hospital. He must be an EMT blue monkey. And so because he's doing the action here, that suggests that the sentence is passive. Okay, let's look at our last sentence. We don't have a by word here, so we're going to have to add it again. By a blue monkey. We have our by word, and we have our monkey. We're going to see, is the monkey doing the verb? Is the monkey giving the boy anything? Let's read the sentence. The doctor gave the boy anti-venom medication by a blue monkey. Doesn't make a lot of sense, but the best interpretation of it is that maybe the boy has a stuffed animal that's a blue monkey, and he's holding on to it as the doctor gives him the painful medicine. And so the blue monkey isn't doing anything. He's certainly not administering venom, anti-venom medication to the boy. And so that tells us that the sentence is active. So all three of our tests get us to the same finish line. It's a good practice to do more than one test if you're not sure about a sentence. Okay, so we are done with this presentation. Hopefully this information is helpful for you. Many students find it useful to watch this presentation more than once so that they can kind of dive into this. As you're watching, jot down questions that you might have. Gosh, that part didn't make sense, or what would it be if we added this phrase to the sentence, or whatever. Send those to me and I'll be glad to cover those and answer any questions that you have about that. Also, please come to my office hours if you find this confusing. Lots of folks struggle with this. It is something you definitely can master, but it does take some time and some work. And so we can go through dozens of sentences until you feel really, really confident that you can identify passive voice. Thanks for your attention and have a wonderful day.